Hello, in this video we're going to revise A-level AQA philosophy, moral philosophy, or also known as ethics. This video replaces the revision material on ethics that used to be in my 2022 revision video online, because there was advanced information then about what was going to be in the exams, so it didn't have everything in it. So this is an update, and it's going out to my patrons on patreon.com/RPE with Dr. T first, before it goes to anyone else. If you're interested in more exclusive and early access videos, head over to that patreon.com/RPE with Dr. T. Here we go. Right, first, normative ethical theory you need to know about in moral philosophy. Remember the distinction in moral philosophy between the three different levels of ethical discussion. You've got the normative ethical theories, first of all, which are your standard bread and butter ethical theories, which are theories about what is right and wrong, what actions are right and wrong, how you work out the right or wrong thing to do, of which there are three most popular, well-known theories. Then you've got meta-ethics, which is more foundational. You could look at it as like sitting underneath normative ethics. That is about what do the words right and wrong even mean, looking at the basics, the sort of underlying assumptions, the underlying meta level of ethics, hence meta ethics. And then you've got applied ethics, which is assuming the truth of the normative theories. How do they actually apply to real life situations? So first of all, you need to know what the normative theories are and about utilitarianism. Nice easy start to the ethics course. Remember first of all that utility, technically in the world of philosophy, doesn't just mean usefulness. It means usefulness for producing pleasure. And this is the aim of action, what should be the aim of action according to utilitarians, isn't it? We should be aiming to maximize utility. In other words, bring about the most amount of pleasure or happiness. For Bentham, it's more like pleasure. For Mill, it's a bit more like happiness, for the most amount of people, to maximize utility. So our actions should be aiming to bring about that. Hence, it's a consequentialist theory, you'll remember, which means that it is interested in consequences. The good is concerned with the consequences of actions. So do that which will bring about consequences which maximize pleasure. And this was invented, discovered, you might claim, by Bentham in the 18th century, a Brit, one of our own, and his form on the specification is being called quantitative hedonistic utilitarianism. You'll remember that that means he's concerned with quantity of pleasure, and purely quantity in his case, just straightforwardly what actions will maximize the most amount of pleasure to the most amount of people without any additions or qualifications. And it's called hedonistic because it's to do with pleasure, hedone, Greek for pleasure. And he has a utility calculus, doesn't he, which has different factors that you need to take into account when you're deciding what action to do and working out how much pleasure it's going to maximize relative to other actions which you're considering. It's not a utility calculator, like students sometimes say. It's a method of working out quantities, even though he doesn't actually assign numbers to these quantities. You're considering things in a quantitative way. So it's a calculus, and there are 7 factors. My way of remembering it currently is I don't really care, fight philosophy examiners, so IDRCFPE. That would be intensity, duration, remoteness, certainty, fecundity, propinquity, is it? And extent, something like that. To be honest, they never ask what are the different parts of the utility calculus. Even if you can just remember some of them, then you'll be fine when you're explaining Bentham's ideas. You don't need to go into detail about every single one. You're probably going to waste time in an exam if you're doing that. Useful to have them up your sleeve, I suppose. So that's Bentham, the inventor of utilitarianism. Do what will bring about the most amount of pleasure. It's quite an intuitive, straightforward moral theory, isn't it? Although not without its problems, as we'll see. So on to Mill, who developed it and updated it. As you know, his form is being called on our specification qualitative hedonistic utilitarianism. So still hedonistic, still ultimately interested in maximizing pleasure. It's just that Mill adds in the idea of the quality of the pleasure. So you don't want to just go for straightforward amount, you want to be maximizing the most of the right kinds of pleasure. So Mill brings in this distinction between higher and lower pleasures, where not all pleasures are equal. Some pleasures are better than others. People who have experienced lots of different kinds of pleasure, including the higher ones, will be competent judges to know and understand from experience that certain pleasures of the mind, things like listening to my wonderful voice on this philosophy revision video, or listening to classical music, or reading Shakespeare, or all comparable experiences, are more pleasurable and better, are better in some way qualitatively, they are more enjoyable and longer lasting and so on, than base lower pleasures of the body, things like getting drunk on a Friday evening, which you never do and certainly wouldn't even dream of doing until you reach the legal drinking age of 18, or eating or playing pub games or whatever. You want to maximize the high quality pleasures, the higher pleasures, over the lower ones. So those are most important and qualitatively better. They feel better and they're more valuable, and ultimately they last longer. So that is incorporated into utilitarianism with Mill. Hence qualitative hedonistic utilitarianism, maximize the right kinds of pleasure. It's still the most of it. You're still interested in amounts. So it doesn't completely eradicate the idea of quantity, but because you've got the quality being considered in there, that's why the designation changes. And you also need to know about Mill's proof of the greatest happiness principle. You'll remember that that comes up on meta-ethics as well. This is where Mill argues that the sign that something is desirable is that it is desired. Happiness is desired by everyone, therefore happiness is desirable. And the way he's using desirable there, in that way that I've phrased his argument, is in the sense of should be desired. So Mill effectively argues with this so-called proof, so-called because it's debated whether it actually works. I don't think it works because of the is-ought problem, but that's up to you to decide. He's arguing, isn't he, that because everybody is seeking pleasure anyway and trying to bring about pleasure, this is enough of an indicator that this is what we should be doing in our actions and in our lives, because if this is what everyone wants anyway, that is a reason to do it. That is evidence that this is what should be done. Morally speaking, we should be trying to maximize happiness because this is what everyone is interested in anyway. And if you combine all of those individuals who are interested in it, that gives you the conclusion that therefore we should be interested in the happiness for the aggregate, for everybody, and be pursuing maximal happiness for all people. So yeah, Mill tries to justify this even more than Bentham. He tries to spell out a justification, but it's highly debatable whether that proof works. There's a bit of evaluation for you. Then there's loads of different forms of utilitarianism out there. You need to know about non-hedonistic utilitarianism as well, although effectively, especially if you look at the Hodder textbook from Cardinal Hayward and Jones, this effectively amounts to, they say, including preference utilitarianism. You basically need to know about preference utilitarianism, most famously advocated by Peter Singer in recent times, probably the most famous living philosopher, we could say. And so this is utilitarianism that's trying to still maximize something, maximize actions which are useful for doing something, but instead of being about maximizing pleasure, like Mill and Bentham are talking about, Singer and others say, well, actually that's a bit too tricky because of some of these problems, particularly how do you calculate pleasure? Can you really put a number on it? So instead of that, they say, let's try and do what is useful for maximizing the satisfaction of preferences, because you can work out or approximate at least what someone's preference is by, preference space is, by asking them, what's your preference? Do you want to keep listening to this video, or do you want to turn it off and go and stick your head in a bucket of cold water? Because that's more enjoyable. No, actually, I'd like to keep listening to the video. All right, so that's your preference. We know what it is. So, well, in my case, it's just a preference of one. So I'm going to keep recording this video because that's my preference. I've considered all the preferences of the people involved. That was a very bad example, but yeah, preference utilitarianism, straightforward again, isn't it? Maximize the satisfaction of preferences, which you find out by asking people, or if you can't ask them, assuming. There's still problems with it, of course, but that's what it is. Slightly clumsily, specification now shoves on a point about act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. That's simple enough, though. Bentham was an act utilitarian. Act utilitarianism is when you are supposed to, as far as possible, work out what to do on an act-by-act basis. So you simply go along, and whenever you need to make a moral decision, you do your calculation, your rough or detailed calculation, I suppose, about what you should do. Rule utilitarianism is effectively saying because that is too impractical to do, can't go around calculating pleasure outcomes for every single act. It's more straightforward and useful and sensible to operate under certain rules of thumb, utilitarian rules, secondary principles, Mill calls them, where you do those actions which will in general maximize pleasure, e.g. classic moral philosophy example, do not murder. On the whole, it's not going to maximize pleasure to kill people. So you live under a rule, a utilitarian rule still, mind. They are still ultimately interested in the consequence, not the action for its own sake, of not killing and not committing murder. And that means that in general you will be maximizing pleasure. And then there's further distinctions within that. You'll remember, like two-tier utilitarianism, for example, advocated by Richard Hare, where you do rule most of the time, except when you get to a difficult, sticky situation where the rule is clashing with your intuitions. Like, say, okay, I'm going along not killing, I'm enjoying living my life, it seems to be maximizing pleasure, not killing anyone, but oh no, now I've got a situation where I might need to kill someone in order to save a load of other people. So then, for two-tier utilitarians, then you revert when your intuitions raise problems to an act utilitarian calculation. Okay, the general rule's not seeming to work so well here. Let's do a specific calculation. Oh, it seems that maximizing pleasure in this case will come from killing somebody, so I'm going to kill someone. There you go. That's how you could combine the two. But Mill is broadly a rule utilitarian. There we go. It's just so hard to say. I'm not going to delete the whole video because of this though, because I can't press stop in PowerPoint, which I'm recording this on. Mill is a rule utilitarian. There we go. I did it. Round of applause for me. And yeah, Bentham act. Then issues with utilitarianism. Whether pleasure is the only good. Remember Nozick's experience machine, where he says if you're presented with a machine that you could get into and it would make you experience total pleasure indefinitely, but you're cut off from reality, he thinks most people wouldn't go into that, and that's evidence for Nozick that pleasure cannot be that which we are most concerned with, because if we were, we'd go into this machine, but most people, or lots of people, wouldn't. So there must be something else which is the good, which we should be interested in maximizing or pursuing over and above simply just pleasure and happiness, like maybe states of affairs in the real world, or relationships with real people, or achievements in reality, and so on, and not just experiencing total pleasure. Otherwise we might just all go into this drug-induced stupor for the rest of our lives, and we'd think we'd be happy with that. Then you've got fairness and individual liberty / rights, including the risk of the tyranny of the majority. So this is the criticism that utilitarianism is going to overlook individuals sometimes. Say, if you think that actually we should never kill, like we said earlier, but it turns out if you kill in this situation, say in Jim and the Indians from Bernard Williams, or in the case of Thompson's backpacker, who's going to give you some organs to save some unhealthy people who need organ donations if you kill them. If you don't believe that murder, say, should ever be committed, then utilitarianism might lead you into problems, because it's always going to tell you to do that which will maximize happiness whatever the action is. So the ends can justify the means in straightforward utilitarianism. So what about means that are sometimes unfair to people, or are going to violate people's so-called human rights, or sacrifice individuals? And when this is writ large, this becomes the tyranny of the majority. So say you're doing a utility calculation for a country as part of a governmental decision, or even a preference, a preference utilitarian calculation, which is very similar to what democracy is, where you're going with what the majority want. Sure, the overall happiness might be maximized. There might be more happy people than not, but what if the people who are not happy are really unhappy because you're exploiting them? Like, what if a minority in the country is overlooked because they don't get the majority say, and they're mistreated as a result? What if everyone votes for something which a small number of people don't like? So a very extreme example might be something like the gladiatorial arena, right? Where a lot of people are enjoying watching some prisoners be killed, or watching some gladiators fight and kill each other violently. It's not very fun for the gladiators or the prisoners or what have you, but everyone else is having a good time. So that majority is tyrannizing the minority who are losing out in the utility calculation. Then you've got problems with calculation. This is one of the biggest problems with utilitarianism, I think. How there's all sorts of variants of these, but just to summarize quickly, how do you actually calculate pleasure outcomes? Is that really possible? Can you really put a number on amount of pleasure, or the different factors that Bentham considered? You can dispute that and say actually it's too difficult. And also, because this is all about consequences, this ties into how consequences can be unpredictable, which is not such a problem for utilitarianism, I don't think, because you should be going on what you expect the consequences to be. But it's still true that you might intend one thing and something completely different happens. So you've got a calculation problem there. There are others to do with how you split the pleasure, whether you go for lots of people having a small amount of pleasure, or one person or a small amount of people having a huge amount of pleasure, and so on. Problems with distribution of pleasure in your calculation, and there are still others, but these are all fall under the set broadly of problems with calculation. Oh yeah, and of course you've got the issue of which beings to include. That will come up when we get to applied ethics. Wow, this is going to be a really long video, but that's okay. Some of you are paying for this video early, so you need bang for your buck, and in any case it'll increase my watch hours on YouTube. So we want to cover everything properly here. We want to cover everything properly. Yeah, which beings to include? Do you include animals and so on? We'll come to that when we get to applied ethics. Issues around partiality. This is going to be an issue for pretty much, well, all moral theories except possibly virtue ethics, depending on how you slice it. Utilitarianism demands impartiality, so that you make moral decisions based on reason alone, and you act as a kind of impartial referee without letting your own personal feelings and emotions come into the decisions. However, is that really possible if you're faced with whatever, your mum or a doctor in a car crash, and you can only save one of them? You're probably going to save your mum if you've got a good relationship with your mum, that is, or had one, even though the doctor might save much more other people in their lives, unless your mum's a doctor. Let's not worry about that too much, but the point is your own personal relationships and emotions and so on are going to come into your decisions. Maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they should. If you think they should, if you think it's impractical, if you think it's impractical to be impartial, then you might have an issue with utilitarianism because it demands impartiality. And finally, whether utilitarianism ignores both the moral integrity and the intentions of the individual. So many possible criticisms of utilitarianism, and you really need to select from these carefully if you're writing an essay on utilitarianism. But this is I mentioned Jim and the Indians from Bernard Williams earlier. It's actually the first part of this bullet point that is meant to be illustrative of not so much the fact that utilitarianism can lead to counterintuitive decisions that overlook people's individual liberty, but the fact that it might require you to do things. You could see it as another way of phrasing the same thing, but it might require you to do things which go against your own integrity. Like if you are not a person who morally likes to kill people, or believes that that's a good principle to enact, then utilitarianism might require things of you that compromise your own integrity, your trueness to yourself, and your the reality of your being as an integrated moral whole. That was a very pretentious way of saying it, but yeah, it might get you to compromise on your principles, might be another way of saying it. And also it's not so interested in intentions, utilitarianism. Perhaps a minor point, but you can set out to do something absolutely awful, but if accidentally along the way you produce good consequences, then you've done something technically that's good according to utilitarianism. And some philosophers might have a problem with that and say therefore that shows that there are serious problems with utilitarianism. Like, what if you set out to, I don't know, attack someone but accidentally push them out of the way of a moving car that was going to hit them, or something like that? Bravo, you've done something good, says utilitarianism, because you have brought about overall happiness. It might not even really say that though, so I'm not too worried about that criticism. But anyway, I shouldn't be evaluating, I'm just telling you what the criticisms are. There you go, there's our first slide on utilitarianism done. Okay, let's carry on to how you would do the utilitarianism essay if it came up. So remember, in moral philosophy, there's basically only, let me see, and there's actually only 4 essays really they can ask you. They can ask you, is utilitarianism any good? 25 marks. They can ask you, is Kantian ethics any good? 25 marks. They can ask you, is virtue ethics any good? Then in theory they could ask an applied ethics 25-mark essay question, but they've never done that, so I've given up predicting it. I'm just not sure it's going to happen. I mean, there's a very, very small chance, I suppose, but I just, yeah, they haven't done it in however many years. How many years are we at this making of this video? We're at 9 years, I think. Yeah, about that. 8 or 9 years of A-level philosophy exams on this specification. They've still never done an applied ethics essay, so I think it's just not going to happen. So that means the last one they can give you is a meta-ethics essay, and these could all be phrased in different ways. In fact, there's two, in particular, there's 2 main different ways they can phrase the meta-ethics essay. But this means you effectively need 4 really good, and maybe actually only 3 really good essay plans for moral philosophy, because what's come up the previous year never comes up again. They never do a repeat 2 years in a row. And actually this is the one that they've asked the most. This has come up like 3 times or something at the time of recording. So it's the lowest likely one for it to come up, the utilitarianism essay, but there's still a chance, and someone might be watching this in the far future where it's utilitarianism's turn again. It's useful to look at it as well for thinking about how to do moral philosophy essays in general. But yeah, if I was doing this in a class, which obviously I do, or with a tutorial, I'd get you to think about this for a moment first. You might want to pause the video depending on what you're setting you're in and talk about this now. But yeah, just making the point that usually best to argue for what you actually think in a philosophy essay. Hopefully you do actually think something. If not, I suppose you've got the cynical blagger's guide here as well. Although actually it's quite hard to do a cynical blagger's guide for moral philosophy essays in particular, probably more so than any other area of philosophy, I'd argue. Why? Well, because philosophers are pretty evenly split, if you look at the data and the surveys that are out there, over the different the normative moral theories. That is, about a third of contemporary philosophers are utilitarians in the area of moral philosophy, if they have anything to say about moral philosophy at all. About a third are Kantians, and about roughly a third are virtue ethicists, which might tell you something. It might tell you that maybe all the theories are saying essentially the same thing. I mean, they're all theories about the same thing, even if they don't say exactly the same thing clearly, but they might be, you know, saying very similar things but coming at it from different angles, and the distinctions only really come out when you look at extreme situations. That's certainly a position that some people hold, or it could just be that they're equally good or they're equally bad or whatever, but it means it's quite hard to tell you what an examiner is likely to think. I suppose there's a 66% chance they disagree with the theory under discussion. So I suppose, thinking about it now, if you want to be tactical, that means it's better to criticize a theory, I suppose. So yeah, maybe it's more sensible if you're being purely cynical to attack a theory. It's probably easier to argue against a theory than argue for it. But really, if we're having good intellectual integrity, I should be encouraging you to just do what you think. Oh yeah, and this has reminded me that virtue ethics actually comes out very slightly ahead these days. It's quite a trendy, fashionable thing in current times to be a virtue ethicist. But even then, there's still going to be more utilitarians and Kantians combined, not individually, but combined, than virtue ethicists. So play the numbers how you want, or maybe just write a really good philosophy essay. How would you do that? What have I said here? My own view is that most non-philosophers act like utilitarians anyway. Yeah, you could argue that it is the most sort of common sense view. Just do what's going to bring about the most happiness. Who could disagree with that? Like Mill and Bentham say, how are you going to disagree with that? And maybe you can actually argue Kant has a utilitarian core hidden in his theory. But yeah, I'm not sold on utilitarianism. I think it's useful for very large-scale political decisions and policy making, but it's too difficult to live your life as a utilitarian, is my current thinking, because you just can't calculate pleasure outcomes. It's too difficult to do it in any sort of deeply meaningful way. I'm sure we all are doing it in a broad sense, but if you try and make it a rigorous system, I think it breaks down. That's just my thinking at the moment anyway. So maybe not so useful as a blagger's guide. Sorry, I thought there was going to be stuff in this slide about how to structure the essay. So for that, I refer you to my Segal video. Sorry for the dodgy acronym, SEGARL, on how to do 25-mark essays. With normative theories, you basically do, I'm going to argue I like it, or I'm going to argue I don't. Then you explain what it is, but not very long, just like a paragraph or so. Then the G in Segal is for give. In this case, you would give a criticism of utilitarianism. You've got loads to choose from. You can't do them all. It's better to go for depth rather than breadth. So maybe pick 3 or so criticisms. That seems to be the magic number. And then you want as much of the essay as possible to be spent on analysing the criticisms from your own viewpoint and going back and forth. Why someone? So what your view on the criticism is? Do you agree with it, or are you going to defend the theory against it? And then why would someone disagree with you? What would you say back? And then if you can, keep going back and forth on that dialogue for as much of the essay as possible in each section, because then you do that again. You give another criticism, analyze it again in running to another couple of paragraphs, maybe even 3, and then another criticism, and then you conclude at the end. So the bulk of your essay should be, if it's on utilitarianism or any normative theory, analysing the criticisms or some criticisms of the normative theory and saying whether you agree with the criticisms or not and why. Not just listing the criticisms, that will get you a C, maybe a B, but giving your argumentation which analyses the criticisms. Let's keep going. Right, Kant. Here we go. Strap yourselves in. Kantian ethics. For Kant, the good is not located in consequences or happiness. The good is located in a good will. A good will is the will to act morally, the personal decision and choice, volition, and other synonyms to do one's moral duty, do the good actions. So Kant is a deontological theorist, not a consequentialist, or another word we didn't say, we should have said on the last slide, not a teleological ethical theorist. So utilitarianism is consequentialist, and teleological means the same thing, interested in consequences and outcomes. Kant, no, not so. Kant interested in right actions, not right consequences. And so the starting point of what goodness is for Kant is that the best thing in the world, the best thing that one can have, is willing to do the right thing. So a good will that does its moral duty because he believes there is a right action out there for you to discover and work out with your reason. There is always a right action, one right action to do. And yeah, that goodness is wanting to do that. And mind, just because it is your duty, you should be wanting to do the right action purely because it is the right action, not because it will lead to some other good outcome, or it will mean things go well for you, or you will enjoy doing it, or whatever. just because it is your duty. So this is the distinction between acting in accordance with duty, that's when you are doing the right thing and you're in accord with it, but you can act in accord with it, do the right thing for a bad reason, like because you want to get something out of it. Acting out of duty is doing the right thing, doing the right action purely because it is the right action and your reason shows you it is the right action and you have a good will. You are wanting to do it purely because it is the right thing and you've perceived with your reason that it is your moral duty. That is acting out of duty. The reason you are doing your duty, your moral duty, which you should be doing, is because it is your moral duty. You're not just acting in accord with it, where it's sort of incidental, like you happen to be doing it, but it's for some other reason, or at least other primary reason than that because it is your duty. That's why primarily you should be doing it. You are allowed to enjoy it, for Kant. Don't get that muddled. You can enjoy doing the right thing and you can get good stuff out of it. There can be good consequences that arise from it, but the primary reason you should be doing an action is because it is your moral duty, and that means acting out of duty. Hopefully that makes sense. Next on the spec, you've got Kant's distinction between hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives, remember, an imperative is another word for a command. So in here it's standing in for something like a rule, yeah, something which you should do, a command, do this. Hypothetical imperatives are commands or rules, things that you should do in order to achieve some hypothetical goal. So an imaginary goal. So let's say I want to make a good philosophy revision video. That's my hypothetical goal. What imperatives should I follow? Well, in that case, in order to achieve that goal, I should spend lots of time teaching philosophy and reading about philosophy and talking about philosophy, and then I should sit down and say things about philosophy. Then I will fulfill the goal and make a good video. But there's nothing moral about that. I'm allowed to do it, but it's not. I don't have a duty to do it. This is just something that will hopefully help some people and might make me a little bit of cash potentially on the side as well. But yeah, there's no absolute duty to do it. A categorical imperative, though, and this is what morality is all about for Kant. Technically, there is only one categorical imperative, but because we're making the distinction here, we're talking about categorical imperatives as distinct from hypothetical imperatives. A categorical, remember, means something that applies in all cases. So categorically, like across all the different cases, it's in a category of its own. So they're commands which we should follow categorically all of the time. This is what morality is concerned with, according to Kant. Rules which we should be following categorically all of the time, as distinguished from commands, rules which we should follow if we want to achieve certain ends which actually have nothing to do with morality. So Kant's looking in his moral theory for the categorical imperative, that rule or law which will tell us what we should always be doing, how to work out what our moral duty is in any situation. And he ends up concluding that there are different ways of phrasing what this supreme categorical imperative is. Definitely worth memorizing the phrasing. His first formulation of the categorical imperative, remember, is act according to that maxim which you would at the same time will be a universal law without contradiction. In other words, and I know it needs other words because Kant is difficult and he is not the best with words himself. It doesn't roll off the tongue. Do those actions which you would want everyone else in the world to do in the same situation. Actually, sorry, I've already put it the wrong way around. Let me start again. Do those actions which it would be logically possible for everyone to do in the same situation and which you would want everyone to do in the same situation. So you've got an action you're considering. You think, in this situation, would it be possible for everyone to do the thing that I'm considering? If it isn't, then you've already arrived at a problem. You have hit what's called a contradiction in conception, because you can't even imagine everyone doing this action. It wouldn't be logically possible for everyone in the world to do it. Therefore, in this case, the way it comes out of the flowchart, if you're imagining this as a flowchart, is that you never do this action. You have a perfect duty not to do this action. A classic example would be lying. you're considering telling a lie, and you imagine, okay, what would the world be like if everybody lied? Is it possible for everyone to lie? Well, Kant argues no, because if everyone's lying all the time, if you made this the categorical rule, the universal law, then nothing would make sense, because there would be no distinction in human speech between truth and lying. It would be impossible to live in a logical and sensible way. Human enterprise and activity would just break down, because everyone would be talking nonsense the whole time, and no one would be able to tell you what's true about the world, because everyone would just be constantly deceiving each other. So Kant says it's not logically possible to live in a world where everyone lies, which is how you're working out whether it's right to do it or not. It doesn't lead to logical coherence, because if everyone's lying, here's another way of looking at it. If everyone's lying all the time, then the whole notion of truth breaks down, because no one can give you what actually is the case. People are always just constantly saying what isn't the case. So the distinction between truthhood and falsehood is just collapses. So this is just not logical in Kant's brain. It doesn't make sense. It's not possible. It doesn't lead to a coherent system. Therefore, never lie. You get a perfect duty not to lie. However, if it is something that is logically possible for everyone to do, then Kant says the categorical imperative leads you to ask a second question, like I mentioned earlier. Then you say, would you want everyone to do this action in this situation? And if your answer to that is no, so it's logically possible for everyone to do this, but you wouldn't want everyone to do it, then you've arrived at what's called a contradiction in will. This is not an action which you would want everyone to do all the time. What would be an example? Oh no, sorry, and we should say that results in an imperfect duty sometimes not to do this thing. Let me use an example to try and clarify this. So one of Kant's examples is developing your talents. Say you have a talent for, or it might be football, or making philosophy videos, or origami, or basket weaving or something. But let's just talk generically in terms of talents right now. Is it logically possible for you to spend every waking moment working on developing that talent and practicing that talent? Well, with some clarification, let's say every moment when you're not eating and doing other functions necessary for life. Let's say all your spare time. Is it possible to spend every single scrap of your spare time working on your talent and developing it? Well, yeah, it's logically possible. Everyone could do that. Would you want everyone to be working on their talents all the time? Well, probably not, because there are other things to do in life, like recreation and relax and watching other people's philosophy videos, not just making your own, and so on. Therefore, this leads to a contradiction in will. You wouldn't want everyone to be doing this all the time, even though it's logically possible. In which case, now you have an imperfect duty. Sometimes it is not the right thing to develop your talents, but sometimes it's okay. And it must be noted that if you don't get a contradiction in conception or a contradiction in will, then the action is not that you have a perfect duty to do it as a result of going through Kant's system and thought process. You have a perfect duty, you're simply morally permitted to do it. Kant tells you where you aren't allowed to go, but in terms of where you're allowed to go, you can do what you want. That's up to you. So duties for Kant are always negative. Do not lie, do not steal, do not murder, and so on. Morally good actions, it's just you can do it if you want to. Do help little old ladies across the street if you want. Do make philosophy videos if you want. Do give to charity if you want. Actually, one of those was morally neutral, but yeah, morally permissible still. If that was horrendously complicated, it was, yes. Unfortunately, you still need to know it. So I don't know, slow the video down to half speed and repeat the last 5 minutes several times till it gets into your head, or find another textbook. Find Cardinal Hayward Jones or Lacewing or Ethics for A-Level online to explain it to you again. But Kant acknowledges it's tricky. His second way, you need to know both of them, but his second way is a bit more straightforward. He says another way of thinking about this categorical imperative, which should give you the same results, is this. act in such a way as you treat other persons, including yourself, not merely as means to ends, but at the same time as ends in themselves. What does that mean? Well, treat people as valuable and worthwhile in their own right, affirming their existence as independent, rational beings. So treat people as people, in other words, treat people as valuable, not just as means, like utilitarianism might do, you could argue, of getting something else. But please be clear, we had the word merely in there, and I just said the word just as well. So in other words, you are allowed to get things out of people and treat people as means, as long as you don't only do that. So you are allowed to use me, according to Kant, as a means of helping your philosophy revision and improving your philosophy grade. But you must not merely use me as a means, you must treat me as a valuable end in myself by paying me for this philosophy video. No, okay, I'm joking. You can give me money for it if you want, but yeah, the point is you treat people as valuable people. You don't just use them, you affirm their humanity, hence the humanity formulation, the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Right. Actually, even though it's horrendously complicated, it's quicker than utilitarianism because Kant's theory is there's less to know about it. There is a third formulation where you live so as to cultivate a kingdom of ends, but it's not on the spec. So let's get onto issues. What might be the problems? Could there be any problems with the system? Well, what about when you get clashing or competing duties? So like a duty not to lie versus a duty to not allow other people to be killed, as in the case of the axe murderer at the door example, or something like that. Of course, in Kant's mind, you're never going to get clashing and competing duties because he thinks that reason should show you that it's possible to bring about a logically ordered world where everyone's treating each other as ends in themselves, and not just merely as means as an end, and that there won't be contradictions in that. But you can try and argue, you can certainly argue against him. No, sometimes there are going to be instances where duties clash. Like maybe Sartre's one as well. What about your duty to fight for your country versus your duty to care for your mother? Of course, there's a mistake about Kant. I'm finding myself defending Kant for some reason now, but there's a mistake about Kant in there because duties are always negative, remember. So yeah, maybe it needs to be phrased as the duty to not care for your mother and the duty to not fight for your country. But it's debatable whether Kant would say those are duties. So maybe Kant's system will give you clashing duties. That could be the criticism. Here's another strange one. Not all universalizable maxims are distinctly moral. Not all non-universalizable maxims are immoral. So in other words, there might be maxims, rules, laws of action which you're considering where it is logically possible for everyone to do it and you would will it, but actually it's got nothing to do with morality. So doesn't this show that there's something wrong with Kant's system? Like, it's logically possible for everybody to get out of bed on the right every day, and maybe you'd want that, but who cares? Like, that's nothing to do with ethics. Maybe not the best example, but it's the one that popped up in my head today. And what about things where and then non-universalizable ones that are immoral is when you got something that would lead to a contradiction, but do you really have a perfect duty not to do it? Like, well, actually, an example of that escapes me right now. I'm doing this without any notes, just off the top of my head, so you might have to look at one of my other videos, sorry, or look at a textbook for an example of that. I might add it on later if I remember. These ones are more straightforward. What if consequences determine moral values? So that's like just a straightforward disagreement with utilitarianism. If you're a person who places moral value with consequences, then you're just going to disagree with Kant because he thinks that's not where moral goodness lies. It lies with the actions and with a goodwill to do the right actions. Again, something like the axe murderer is really good at bringing this out, because the point of the thought experiment is, you know, if an axe murderer turns up at your door asking to know where somebody is, intuitively we would not tell them the truth and we want to lie, even though that breaks Kantological rules, because we care about the consequences that they might go and kill that person, they might go and kill our friend. So yeah, Kant's going to lead to counterintuitive decisions sometimes, which brings out the importance, the potentially, intuitive importance of consequences when it comes to moral decision making. Kant is also, like we saw with acting out of duty, isn't interested in certain motives which you might think are important in the world of ethics, like things like love, friendship, kindness. Well, arguably isn't interested in those. Certainly he doesn't talk about them up front. So if you think moral decision making is actually about being, again, a bit like the impartiality criticism with utilitarianism, or the partiality criticism, if it's about being embedded and enmeshed in a nexus of relationships of love, friendship and kindness and so on, if it's about respecting certain what are often seen as more feminine values and specificity and so on, Kant's not interested in that. He's interested in cold, calculating, masculine, arguably reason. So maybe he ignores the value of certain more partial motives, or more feminine or more relational motives is maybe a better way of saying it. And lastly, Philippa Foot is very good at expressing another key criticism of Kant, which is that, is any of this really categorical? Is there really a duty which your reason can show you must do? Arguably not. Arguably this is simply that Kant has a particular hypothetical aim of his own, which is to live in a logically ordered world that he would will. But there's nothing binding about that on a higher or lower level, I suppose, depending on how you look at it, which says we have to live in that world. It's just if you want to be Kant, go ahead. You knock yourself out living in a logical world where everyone does what's logically possible that they would will everyone to do. But there's no higher reason why anyone should do that or should be following it. So this is a meta-ethical criticism. This is how Foot puts it. She says morality is actually about hypothetical imperatives, not categorical, because morality is just a system that tells you how to achieve certain ends if you want to achieve them. So if you want to live in a logically ordered world where you do what you would want everyone else to do, then Kant's very good at telling you how to. But there's no categorical reason why you should be able to force anyone, or that can show you why you should be forced in an epistemic sense to live this way. Is just one way of living. Okay, so meta-ethical criticism saying that there's no foundation to this system, which means that it has to be obeyed. It's just, it works for people like Kant. There's Kant. Now, what do you do if you get a 25 marker on Kant? Which, by the way, I think is quite likely, if you're watching this in 2025, to come up as the 25 marker in the 2025 exam for moral philosophy. Don't shoot me if I'm wrong, but it's looking quite likely on the statistics. So what do you do? Well, it's just the same. All the moral philosophy essays are the same as if it was like a utilitarianism one. Argue with what you think. You've got a statistically most likely to have a sympathetic examiner if you argue against Kant, but I think go for what you think. But it's just the same style of essay. Here's the theory. Sorry, here's one sentence. What do I think? Is it correct? Is it incorrect? Or is it good? Is it not good? Is it helpful, unhelpful? However they phrase it, use the terms of the question. But your statement in answering the question in one sentence at the start, then a brief explanation of Kant and his system. Don't go on for too long, just like a nice healthy paragraph to show you know what you're talking about. And then you dive into the criticisms. You pick the most relevant criticisms, or maybe some very relevant ones and one not very relevant one, so you can show weighting of different criticisms that way. That's another nice tactic. And then you spend as much of the essay as possible analyzing criticisms of the theory, and either defending the criticism against, defending the theory against criticisms, or attacking the theory with criticisms and defending the criticisms against the Kantian style responses, and in each case going back and forth, arguing about the criticisms from both sides and siding on one side yourself through analysis and evaluation. Okay, that is how you do a normative ethics essay. What have I said here? If you get an essay on Kant, you can really argue whatever you like, of course, about his moral system. Actually, as with the other moral theories as well, if you get an essay on any of the normative theories, you can bring in one or more other theories if you like. So like on this one you could bring in utilitarianism on virtue ethics. If you want, if you're like a dyed-in-the-wool utilitarian or virtue ethicist, although maybe I suppose it's easier not to. So I'm just saying, yeah, do it if you want to. You're perfectly entitled to, and you can get marks. However, if you're not sure, it's probably easier just to talk about the one you're examining. I like Kant, actually. I quite like his moral system. I don't ultimately go in for any of the secular moral systems because I think you need a theological religious framework in order to do ethics on any kind of grounding in any sort of sensible way. But there are correspondences between all of the secular moral theories and elements of Christian ethics, which I would advocate for myself. But perhaps most obviously Kant, because he gives you commands, like God gives us commands. Anyway, you don't need to know that necessarily, but that's just what I'd say. I may or may not, do ask me if you want one, send me a message or a comment if in particular you want one. I may or may not post another separate video with more specifics about how I would do an essay on Kant if people want. Just let me know if you're interested in that. I can make it available on Patreon or on YouTube, potentially depending on who wants it, given that this might come up in 2025. But yeah, you spend as much of the essay as possible talking about criticisms of Kant in order to do a Kantian ethics essay. Right, let's get on to virtue ethics itself then. So a completely different way of doing ethics, of course, where utilitarianism is consequentialist and teleological, so interested in consequences and outcomes of actions out there in the world. Virtue ethics is agent-centered, isn't it? As Julia Annas called it in an influential journal article. So it's concerned with developments of characteristics in the moral agent or actor, the person who's doing the deeds and trying to live ethically and virtuously. Is what virtue ethics concerns itself with, rather than consequences of their actions in the world or even the actions themselves, really, as Kant is more interested in. So what's the good, according to virtue ethics, the good for human beings? Well, it's not pleasure. Be clear on this. The good, that which we are seeking to aim for and bring about by living ethically, is eudaimonia, remember, for Aristotle. That's our final end, our telos or goal that we should be trying to work towards through living ethically. And remember, eudaimonia, so literally good-spiritedness. I think flourishing, a state of flourishing, is probably the best English translation, personally. Sometimes gets called other things. Happiness is a bit vague and loose and doesn't underline enough, I think, the relationship between eudaimonia and pleasure / happiness, which is that, yes, if you are eudaimon, if you are exhibiting eudaimonia, Aristotle thinks you're going to be experiencing pleasure, because it's good to be eudaimon, and it does come along with happiness. It goes hand in hand with happiness. However, they are not the same thing. Here it's actually more that a pleasurable existence and a happy life is a consequence of being eudaimon and flourishing, but they are not the same. So we're not aiming for happiness / pleasure, as in utilitarianism, in the world of virtue ethics. We're aiming for a state of flourishing. Why? Well, second bullet point, he gets to this through his function argument, doesn't he? So coming from a teleological view of the world, where everything in the world fulfills a function, Aristotle argues that humans must have a function too. How do you know what a human's function is? Well, you look at what's unique to humans, don't you? And what's unique to us that we have that inanimate objects and other parts of the universe and plants and animals and so on don't? Well, we have a rational aspect of our soul, don't we? We have the ability to reason and think rationally. Therefore, our function must involve thinking and acting rationally, exercising our reason. And this is where there's a bit of a jump. This may be a bit tricky to get your head round as a 21st century person. It certainly is for me, not someone living thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. If we are living rationally, we will be exercising virtues in accordance with reason. Why? Well, all a virtue is a characteristic of something that is performing its function well or excellently. So it's a virtue of a good can opener that it is good at opening cans, it's sharp, easy to hold, so on, etc. Classic example. But for a human, that you to be fulfilling your function well is you're living in accordance with reason, and you will be displaying certain virtues that go hand in hand with that that state and that mode of living. So therefore, our function, our aim, is to think and act rationally in accordance with virtue, and this will bring about eudaimonia. So all these different ideas are interrelated in Aristotle in quite a complicated way, but that's the simplest way I can put it, at least from my understanding of Aristotle. So then, in the rest of the Nicomachean Ethics, bullet point 3, he goes to quite some lengths to expound the specifics of what these virtues that we will cultivate and display if we are exercising our reason and how we live are, doesn't he? And the corresponding vices that they contrast with. So bullet point 3, remember, virtues are character traits or dispositions that we develop. So they're not actions, they're not consequences, they're character traits that we have, like courage or temperance or magnanimity, however you say it. Those kinds of character traits. So because they're traits, you can't just switch them on. You don't just decide, wake up one day and decide to be virtuous. Oh, and look, I've become virtuous, I now have the virtues. You have to be educated and habituated into developing them. So you have to be taught how to do them by following moral exemplars, maybe reading some Aristotle, listening to your philosophy teacher, and you have to practice them. You have to develop the habit of acting virtuously in order to cultivate and develop these character traits in yourself so that you get better and better at doing it. So they're like skills. They're not just one-time decisions. It's not an actions table that you read off. You have to develop the skill of living virtuously in order to cultivate the virtues, and always come back to those character traits, because remember, that's what Aristotle's fundamentally interested in, because the actions that bring these about can change, as we'll say in a minute, but the virtues that he wants us to aim for do not change for Aristotle, although of course modern virtue ethicists have adapted his list of virtues and decided on their own preferred virtues. So again, because you don't just once decide to do this and then you can rationally do it, as Kant might say, you need to get your feelings on board as you are developing these virtues, because we don't just have a rational thinking part of our soul, we also have the emotional and feeling part of our soul, which can sometimes, depending on how virtuously we have been living, be in conflict with our reason and what we, if we think about it, see we should be doing, and the ways that we, if we think about it, see that we should be living. So as we practice and form the habit and receive education in the development of moral character, our feelings will come on board with our rational desire to live virtuously, and they'll start to line up more and more with virtuous character traits. And the doctrine of the mean is last on this bullet point, but we could have mentioned it earlier. Remember, these virtues, Aristotle's list of virtues, they always lie in between two different vices: a vice of excess, when you have too much of a certain character trait, and a vice, a kakia, of deficiency, when you don't have enough of the character trait. So the classic example, which I'm going to give, but if you have another one and you're asked about this, I would use it because the examiners were going to read about courage so much. But the classic example is courage. Too much of the character trait of courage, then you're rash, that's rashness. Not enough of the character trait, and then you're cowardly, so that's cowardice. So you want to hit the mean character trait that lies in the middle between those two extremes. But remember, you will not achieve that and cultivate that through doing the same action in every situation. Sometimes the mean virtue, which is what Aristotle's interested in, will look like attacking if it's courage, or being assertive. Sometimes it will look like backing off. Sometimes it might look like doing nothing at all. But you can't straightforwardly map actions onto virtues like that. So it's not the mean action. It's the mean character trait, the virtue that's in between two extremes. And then you work out what actions are going to bring about and cultivate that character trait in you, which is why virtue ethics gets called flexible. And if you are asked to evaluate virtue ethics, then that can either be a strength or a weakness of virtue ethics, depending on what you want from a moral theory, which I suggest you say up front if you get an essay on it, because then you can evaluate it against that yardstick. So one man's flexible, or one person's flexible, to be gender inclusive, is another person's vague or wishy-washy. Don't say wishy-washy in the exam. But then we come on to moral responsibility in Aristotle. This is really tricky. So 3 different terms for how Aristotle understands whether you volunteered to do an action or not, whether you chose to do it or not. There's a really good diagram about this in the Cardinal Hayward-Jones textbook, which I refer to you. Go and make your own version of that diagram if you haven't got one already, and memorize it in case you're asked about this. But basically, to run through it really quickly, Aristotle, if you're trying to work out whether you are responsible for an action, he says think about it in this way. First ask, did you intend to do it? So that's the most straightforward one. If yes, then it was voluntary and you are responsible for the action. So that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? If no, then there's another question. Were you ignorant of what you were doing or not? Were you aware of what you were actually doing and the consequences? If you were ignorant of what was going on, then it's a non-voluntary action, this third one. In this case, you are responsible because you still did something, but there's the possibility of forgiveness if you regret what you did without knowing it, e.g. King Oedipus choosing to kill his father and marry his mother. Didn't know what was going on, so if he's sorry, and he's definitely sorry, then can be forgiven. But that's the non-voluntary, because you weren't in full awareness of the circumstances and the option that you were choosing. If you were not ignorant of what was going on, you were fully aware of what choice you were making in doing something naughty, or in Aristotle's language, cultivating a negative disposition, or failing to cultivate a virtuous disposition. There's one more question. Were you forced to do what you were aware you were doing? If you were forced, then it's an involuntary action that you were of a second class that you were compelled to do. So it's an involuntary compelled action. E.g., I knew I was killing my father and marrying my mother, but I was literally forced to do it. It's kind of hard to imagine how that situation could ever come about. But insert your own example. It's a bit of an unfortunate example. So in this case, you are not responsible. If, however, you were not ignorant of what you were doing and you were not forced, which probably means that there was some external influence on your action, which isn't so strong as to be called a compulsion, e.g. you weren't literally grabbed by the arm and made to take the cookie from the cookie jar with no actual willful participation of your own. But if it's more like someone was holding a gun to your head saying, take the cookie from the cookie jar, and so you still actually chose to do it, but it was under a more external kind of influence, then that is an involuntary mixed action. And again, for Aristotle, you are responsible for this with the possibility of forgiveness if you regret the action, like a standard non-voluntary action. So that's pretty darn complicated, but that's the best I can explain it. I suggest making a diagram or flowchart to go through all those different options and then getting them into your head. Let's keep going. The relationship between virtues, actions, and reasons, and the role of practical reasoning / wisdom, phronesis, in Aristotle. So basically, this is a bit like another flowchart, really. Remember that for Aristotle, you have reasons to do things because you are a rational soul and you've thought about it, and you see that what you should be aiming for is to become eudaimon and cultivate virtue, which are your motivations for doing actions which bring about the virtues in yourself. And the process of applying your reason to work out what actions will bring about what virtues, and I suppose what virtues you should be aiming for in the first place, that is a process that involves a process of practical wisdom, which again you have to work at developing and be educated and habituated into, because it's a skill, phronesis, that you have to develop. I suppose, properly speaking, it most is concerned with the application of reason in order to work out what actions will bring about what virtues. But that's the way the flowchart kind of goes. Reasons motivate actions, which lead to developing virtues, and your feelings will align more and more with these virtuous actions as you work at this. So there's virtue ethics in a nutshell. This is going to be a very long video, but that's fine. There's lots of content for A-level philosophy, even in a advanced information year. And hopefully you've had enough time to watch this whole video if you're finding it useful, or skip to the relevant bits. What are issues with virtue ethics? Well, here's some. We've already mentioned this one a bit earlier. Does it really give sufficiently clear guidance about how to act? Well, arguably no, because you're not really being told do this, do that, like Kant would, or given a clear external idea to aim for. So it's up to you to work out how you're going to cultivate the virtues that Aristotle suggests you should be seeking, or perhaps in modern forms of virtue ethics that you want to be cultivating. Although again, if you think that's the best a moral theory can do, and it shouldn't be trying to give rigid rules about how to live, but giving a more of a framework, or indeed a rougher set of guidelines, then maybe you do think that is sufficient. So that's, I think, really is up to you and your own moral intuitions, although you might have more pedantic and logical ways of picking holes in the alternative moral theories, if you like virtue ethics. Then you've got the problem of clashing and competing virtues. So what about when it's not clear which virtue to prioritize in a certain scenario or circumstance, and there's the possibility of cultivating multiple different virtues, but it doesn't look like it's going to be possible to cultivate them in tandem with one another, so they're going to be competing. Example, well, let's take, say, euthanasia, and let's take perhaps the more modern virtues of compassion or justice, although I believe justice is actually one of Aristotle's virtues. Do you aim to prioritize and cultivate the virtue of compassion by allowing the person who is very unwell to pass away, and facilitating that by carrying out euthanasia? Or do you aim to cultivate the virtue of justice, or perhaps tough love, by refusing to allow them to pass because it's against the law, because it's taking a life, and so on? So maybe a slightly artificial example, you might have better ones, but what do you do when the virtues are competing against one another? Then we've got the possibility of circularity involved in defining virtuous acts and virtuous persons in terms of each other, because how does Aristotle get his list of what virtues to aim for? Well, he thinks you can just work them out by thinking about it, but whether that's true or not is definitely up for debate, isn't it? Because he probably gets them from the supposedly virtuous people of the ancient Greek intellectual elite, people like him, unsurprisingly. Middle-aged white men who think very hard about things and are esteemed by certain sectors of society for doing so, much like many philosophers today. So isn't that circular? Because you ask him, how do we know what the virtues are? And he says, well, look at these virtuous people. It's the character traits that they have. Well, how do we know that they are virtuous? Because they act virtuously and they have the virtuous character traits. We're in a circle here. How do we step outside the circle and externally verify what actually are the virtuous positive characteristics to be aiming for? And then, I might have sandwiched 2 bullet points here together, or they might be together on the spec. Whether a trait must contribute to eudaimonia in order to be a virtue. This is the idea that you could theoretically have someone who was living in an extremely virtuous way, say a nurse working at the front line in Ukraine, slogging their guts out to take care of other people and being extremely generous with their time and courageous and honest and so on and so forth. But they're actually really miserable because they're working so hard and the conditions are so terrible. They're under so much stress, and pressure, so that they are really not flourishing. Doesn't that suggest that there is a disconnect here potentially between living virtuously? What if doing these actions and aiming to cultivate these virtues doesn't actually lead to flourishing and being eudaimon? There's a possible criticism. And then the relationship between the good for the individual and moral good. Some philosophers are just going to turn around, aren't they, and say, well, it's all very well saying that we should be aiming to cultivate certain traits in ourselves, and that's what ethics is all about. But isn't that far too individualistic? Isn't that just focusing on oneself? Really, morality should be about what you are putting into the world, what you're contributing to the world as part of the human community, and how you are influencing and affecting it, not just perhaps, or not even at all perhaps, what sort of personality or what sort of traits you are developing in your own being. So yeah, just because something is good for an individual doesn't mean it necessarily is contributing to a wider communitarian moral good. So lots of ways to attack virtue ethics and pick holes in it potentially as well. How do you do a virtue ethics essay then if you get the 25 marker is on virtue ethics? Well, all my advice I've given about the utilitarianism essay and the Kantian essay, all of that applies here as well. You give criticisms of virtue ethics and you analyze them. You go back and forth on them and pick a side, arguing consistently all the way through in order to give your overall opinion about whether it's a useful, helpful, correct, whatever, persuasive theory or not. Convincing, they use that words, they've used that sometimes. Always use the terms of the question. Same odds about whether you're likely to have a virtue ethicist marking your paper. If you're being really cynical, probably easier to criticize it, but if you like virtue ethics, go ahead, you'll probably argue better in favor of it if you actually like it. Now hang on, don't listen to my voice, don't go entirely with what I've accidentally left in the slide here, because I've said you almost certainly won't get an essay question on utilitarianism. Actually, no, sorry, that is still true. This slide wasn't made for 2025 originally, but that is actually now true again for 2025 because utilitarianism was the essay last year. Yeah, so blah blah blah, that's kind of useless what I've written there, but it's all the same advice. I quite like virtue ethics, but I think ultimately it fails in a theory because of the criticism that doesn't provide clear enough guidance. That is the sort of key pivotal criticism of virtue ethics that you need to defend against if you're arguing for it, or that you can use, I'd say, if you're criticizing it and doing a critical essay. And I think this has a lot to do with what you want from an ethical theory, right? Because some people, philosophers, think you can have and want an ethical theory that tells you exactly what to do in certain terms, and that's what ethics' job is. It should be giving us precise instructions to follow, clear commands, whether they're consequentialist or deontological. Some people, philosophers, don't think an ethical theory can legitimately do that, or just don't want that. They want a framework for thinking about life's messy, complex decisions. And this is what virtue ethics is more giving you, a set of guidelines, a framework, a way of thinking about ethics, rather than something that's going to give you very clear, precise, calculable procedures, arguably. So how you evaluate a normative ethical theory, I've said here, this is the thing I do stand by in this slide, has a lot to do with what you want from a normative ethical theory at all. And there's no hard and fast rules, like mathematical rules, that everyone agrees on about what an ethical theory can do and should be able to do. So if you're aware of your preferences or assumptions or starting points or intuitions about that, and can clarify those, you can use those as a yardstick for how you evaluate the normative ethical theories, or whichever normative ethical theory you're talking about in a given essay. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Okay, next bit of revision of applied ethics. So the next thing it says on the specification is that students must be able to apply the content of normative ethical theories and meta-ethics to the following issues. Now, just a quick word on this. metaethics is on here, but they've never really asked anything specifically about how metaethics could be, the metaethics content could be applied to these issues. Like I said before, applied ethics has never come up as an essay, a 25-mark essay in 8 or 9 years. There's never been a 25-marker on it in which you could talk about metaethics and these different applied areas. It's quite a difficult thing to do. Actually, no, to be fair, maybe it's difficult. It isn't that difficult, but for some reason they've never asked about this. So, and often when it's taught, including how it's laid out in the scheme of work from AQA, you do applied ethics before metaethics. So this is a bit ridiculous, to be honest. If teachers were really paying attention, they'd put applied ethics last. But everyone I know, and including the suggested AQA scheme of work, because this is how it's laid out on the flipping specification, right? Like, sorry, I'm going off on a dorky rant here, but you've got metaethics after applied ethics on the specification. So no strapped for time teacher is going to spot this and put applied ethics later, because teachers tend to just teach their way through the specification. So I wouldn't worry too much about metaethics and these applied areas. But essentially, what that is about is doing an analysis of what the normative ethical theories say about these areas in meta-ethical terms. So in other words, according to this kind of meta-ethicist, the statement stealing is wrong means this, which actually, to be fair, once you've done meta-ethics, that should be perfectly possible. So just be aware of that, I suppose. The only place I could see it really being relevant based on what has been asked in this exam is in an applied ethics essay, if that miraculously one day comes up. But given that it hasn't so far, I think you'll find you definitely do, however, need to know about how the normative ethical theories apply to these areas, and that is AQA's favourite type of question for a 12-marker in moral philosophy. It is not always, but is almost always the case that the 12-marker in moral philosophy is apply this normative ethical theory to this applied area. So you need to be able to do that. Now then, another note on that. This is not just about memorizing information. Memorizing information is sure, definitely useful, but this is actually, because even the textbooks don't just give you, for all of these theories and areas, applied areas, like straightforward information, because this is more about, can you apply what you have learned and know about the theories to these different areas? So you can use language in applied ethics questions, because to be honest, not all utilitarians are going to do it in the same way. Not all utilitarians are going to agree about stealing or simulated killing or eating animals, telling lies. Neither will all Kantians or virtue ethicists, especially virtue ethicists, because there's different interpretations of the theories, and thus the applications are going to be subtly different, whatever the philosophers who originally presented them think about how straightforward they are in their application. And there's also different varieties of the theories, and also there's going to be different situations within these areas. Not all stealing is the same, not all simulated killing is the same, etc. So what is useful to be able to do is say things like, a utilitarian might do this because, as opposed to just straightforwardly, utilitarians would say this as if it's the gospel truth. Much better to show that you have a nuanced understanding, so you understand the shades of grey, not just the black and white in applied ethics, because it's going to vary from case to case and from ethicist to ethicist. Okay, so try and for these questions keep yourself in the mode of a utilitarian might say, or would say, or could say. Could might be the best word. And then you explain why. That's what really gets you the marks, your explanation for why you envisage such an ethical theorist would say such a thing in such an applied situation. Okay, all that waffle and preamble out of the way, let's actually talk about what the theories might say about these areas. So stealing, well, for a utilitarian, it's going to depend, isn't it, on whether the stealing maximizes utility. In theory, a utilitarian is going to be fine with stealing in certain cases, as long as it brings about the most amount of happiness to the most amount of people. So maybe you could steal from an evil, super rich corporation that isn't going to notice that much in order to share your stealings with the poor, because you're going to bring about most overall happiness. Certainly for an act utilitarian, it's quite easy to argue that, someone like Bentham. And maybe this is a weakness of utilitarianism if you don't like stealing, like Aristotle and Kant. and other people. Rule utilitarian. It's happening to me again. Try saying rule utilitarians fast 5 times. Rule utilitarians are gonna find it harder though, aren't they? Because they've got rules about what generally will maximize happiness and won't, and quite straightforward to argue that in general stealing is not going to maximize happiness. It's not going to go well for you, and it's not nice to the people you're stealing from. So probably rule utilitarians may have a rule: do not steal. That's quite controversial, isn't it? So unless it's a really counterintuitive situation and they're a weak rule utilitarian or 2-tier one, they might not find themselves able to steal when following the dictates of their moral theory. Preference utilitarians, probably most people don't want to be stolen from, so you're probably in the minority if you want to do some stealing. Although again, just as with ACT, you could argue, couldn't you, that if you want to steal and enough people want you to steal, because maybe they're going to get what you steal shared among them, as with the example we gave earlier, then you could justify stealing on preference utilitarian grounds. So as usual, we see, and this is going to be the case for all the areas, utilitarianism is flexible. The least flexible part of it is rule utilitarianism, and this means therefore that in some cases it may be possible to justify this action based on the theory. That's going to apply to all the other areas, although it gets a bit more complicated with eating animals for utilitarianism. And that, by the way, is the way to do a question, an applied ethics 12 marker, say, on utilitarianism and an applied ethical area, because you've got all these different forms that you've learned about. They're on the specification of utilitarianism, so you just walk through all of them and sensibly explain how each type would apply to the area. Let's do it bullet point by bullet point rather than theory by theory, because that's going to be more interesting for everybody. Then Kant on stealing. Kant, of course, is going to tell you, no, do not steal. And you can demonstrate that quite straightforwardly by just stealing through the categorical imperative. Is it logically possible to live in a world where everyone steals all the time? No, because the whole concept of property and ownership breaks down. In Kant's mind, certainly, this is not going to lead to a logically coherent world. If everyone's just taking everyone else's stuff, then how do you know who has what? And you can't trust anybody. It's not rational. It makes no sense, according to Kant. Actually, Kant would have a German accent, but I'm not very good at German accents, so I won't attempt one for everyone's benefit. Yeah, so don't steal, according to Kant. It works for the second formulation as well, doesn't it? Because if you steal from somebody, then you are not treating them as an end in themselves at all. You're being unkind to them, you're harming them, taking something away from them. You're not treating them as a rational, independent being, and you're not treating yourself rationally. So you're just using people to get stuff. You're using them merely as a means to an end. So don't steal. And you could even do it in terms of the third formulation as well. You are not living so as to bring about a kingdom of ends, a kingdom of people who are treated as valuable in themselves if you steal. So on all three formulations, it fails. You have a perfect duty not to steal, therefore. If you expand a bit on that, you've got a 12 marker on Kant and stealing. And that, by the way, is how to do an applied ethics question about Kant. Walk the considered action through the first formulation and then the second formulation of the categorical imperative, and maybe the third if you like, explaining in as much detail. So in this case, that led to a contradiction in conception, didn't it? Contemplating stealing. So Kant, simple rule, do not steal. And then virtue ethics, we're back to flexibility again, and even more flexible than utilitarianism, because you are doing what is going to most bring about virtuous character in virtue ethics. Now, actually, I spoke too soon there, though, haven't I? Which is what tripped me up, because it is more flexible. However, Aristotle, for stealing and murder, has a little line where he says that nonetheless, stealing is never going to bring about the mean characteristic. It can never be a golden mean cultivating action. So actually, stealing this is one of the pieces of information you do need to know, a footnote to help you with your application of the theories. Stealing is on Aristotle's blacklist as an action which should never be done. So actually Aristotle comes out as do not steal, because he thinks it will never, whatever situation you're in, it's never going to develop the mean. It's never going to develop you into a more virtuous person and further your progress towards eudaimonia to steal. Therefore, do not steal. Yeah, however, then we can go back to flexibility for modern virtue ethics. So a modern virtue ethicist, however, might say in certain circumstances, because they're not bound by Aristotle's writings and particular views, it might be virtuous to steal. Like maybe you're living in a really weird, unusual extreme setting like a concentration camp, and it's actually going to make you a better person to steal in those cases. Maybe you're Robin Hood, maybe you're stealing from an evil corporation like we mentioned earlier, maybe you're just taking a little bit of Jeff Bezos's money somehow and sharing it around. Maybe this is cultivating a virtuous character and developing the virtue of justice, perhaps, rob from the rich to give to the poor, or the virtue of generousness because you're going to share out what you've stolen, or the virtue of cunning, virtue of survivability. That's not a very elegant virtue, but you see what I mean. That's how it could work for virtue ethics. Oh, and by the way, that's how you do a virtue ethics question on applied ethics. You explore what virtues the considered action would bring about, and you also have to know if Aristotle says anything specific about it, like he does about stealing. And of course, that means you can argue it the other way as well. So don't forget to mention in virtue ethics question. However, it's easy to see how for modern virtue ethicists, like Aristotle concludes, it might be the case that they say most of the time, actually, though, stealing is not going to make you a better person. It's not going to bring about positive or likable or desirable character traits in you. So you should not be stealing. It's not going to increase your progress towards flourishing. Flourishing people do not nick stuff off others. So there you go. Don't forget that bit as well. Hopefully that's shown you roughly how you would go about doing a question on applied ethics for stealing. Let's just quickly run through the other areas then as well. So utilitarianism and simulated killing, same thing. If it's making you and other people happy, why not? Why not kill people in computer games, plays and films? We're only interested in the pleasure outcomes, and so if these things bring pleasure, we're not worried about any categorically bad actions that might be being simulated or encouraged here. So go ahead. I mean, again, though a rule utilitarian might be a bit more cautious, because if there's a rule, do not murder, then there might be ambivalence or hesitation about a related action of simulate murder. So they might have a rule of, in general, don't simulate murder, but it's going to be case by case here for a utilitarian, right? So if you can convincingly show that if you're killing in computer games, it's making you say, or whatever, it's making you a more violent person and you're going to contribute to the world in a negative way, as some people try and argue, then you might have utilitarian grounds for not simulating killing. Otherwise, it's going to be okay because it's bringing about more pleasure. This is the sort of thing you could say in an answer. Kant, well, you're not actually taking away anyone's life if you're simulating killing, and I'm sure Kant was fine with plays and so on. And maybe even have watched some, I don't know, in his life. I don't know if he had a particular fondness for them. But yeah, plays existed in the 18th century, even though computer games and films didn't. However, where it might become problematic for Kant is if you are participating in something which is going to make you more likely to do the real version of the action in the future. That's where you could see a bit of a Greek or a bit of virtue ethics style thinking in Kant. So on the whole could be all right, because it's logically possible to simulate killing, and you would sometimes potentially want that world. There's no reason you don't ever want that world if people are enjoying watching the simulated killing or participating in it and so on. But if it's going to maybe make you more likely to simulatedly to actually kill, then be careful. So that's a kind of Kantian analysis. And virtue ethics, again, probably all right. You could argue it different ways, and in fact we just did a bit of virtue ethics style argumentation about it, but in the world of Kant. So it's the same idea, really. It could make you a better person to simulate killing, or it might just be morally neutral, in which case you can do it as part of your recreation, which is part of your flourishing. That is participate in it or watch it. But at the same time, if you might argue it might not develop your virtues. It might make you more likely to be violent or actually kill. In reality, therefore, you could do a virtue ethics case for not participating in it. And the extra Aristotle bit here is Greek tragedy and Greek plays, which I encourage you to read about this in addition to watching this video. Go back to the textbook because this is another extra bit. Often there's extra stuff at Aristotle you need to be aware of. So in his culture, obviously, plays hugely popular. The inventors most likely of plays, right? And certainly Western European drama, tragedy and comedy. And there's something called catharsis, which the Hodder textbook talks about in relation to Aristotle and simulated killing. The Greek idea that you can kind of purge the negative emotions in your soul by watching a load of awful things happen to someone else on stage. You kind of experience vicarious release and cathartic cleansing through watching, Oedipus tear his eyes out or whatever after discovering that he's slept with his mother and killed his father. If you don't know what that is, go and look up Oedipus Rex. And yeah, so more Aristotelian Greek style virtue ethics ground for allowing simulated killing. Probably is fine with it, Aristotle. And then you do the previous arguments again for modern virtue ethics. Let's go on to eating animals. Quite a lot to say about utilitarianism and eating animals. So it depends on the utilitarian again, doesn't it? Bentham is just interested in quantity of pleasure, but for anybody, no distinction between higher and lower. Therefore, we should consider animals. We should not be treating animals in a nasty way. We should not be harming them, which might rule out a lot of the kind of farming and eating of them that we do. Mill's interested in higher and lower pleasures, though therefore not so interested in animals, because animals only experience base physical pleasures, can't think, can't reason, can't experience the higher pleasures of the mind. So not so interested in maximizing their pleasure. They're not as important, so probably okay to have a rule that you eat animals. Singer, really interesting one. Do you consider animal preferences in preference utilitarianism? Well, for most preference utilitarians, yes, you do, because animals do have a kind of preference. It's not a highly developed conscious preference, but there is a kind of sentience there, according to Singer and according to most scientists these days. So we should be considering animal preferences. To not do so would be what Singer coined as speciesist, right? Not racist, but speciesist, discriminating against other species. Therefore, treat animals well in how you farm them and look after them, and maybe actually don't eat them. Maybe if it's lived a nice life and achieved everything it's wanted to achieve in its life and got to a ripe old age, then if it dies of natural causes, you can eat it. I'm being facetious, right? But the point is, for preference utilitarian, usually you do consider the preferences of animals, and most animals don't want to be eaten, if not all, if they have any kind of sentience, so we shouldn't be eating them. Or if we are under certain circumstances, it should be in ways where they're treated humanely. I think it's ridiculous to talk about treating animals humanely, treating animals animalanely, or something like that. And then virtue ethics, what kind of person are you becoming in eating animals? Aristotle's probably fine with it because of his, like all philosophers, especially old-timey philosophers, his love of reason and emphasis on the value of human beings coming from their ability to reason. Animals have nutrition and growth and perception, but they don't have reason, therefore not as important as us. So you're not becoming a worse person by eating animals. It's going to be part of your flourishing to eat animals. However, as usual, a modern virtue ethicist might be able to take the same principles and adapt them and interpret them slightly differently. Wouldn't be so bound to Aristotle's carnivorous culture, I might say, no, you're not becoming a better person if you eat animals and mistreat them in that way. So you're becoming a worse person, you're becoming callous and heartless and cruel, so don't do that. And to be fair to Aristotle, Aristotle would most likely accommodate a little bit of that, like, yeah, eat animals, but don't torture animals, don't treat them in a really horrific way when you're rearing them and farming them, because that's not going to make you a very virtuous person. That's not going to be part of eudaimonia. And then finally, telling lies. You see how, I'm doing this all off the top of my head, and that's not really from memory, because I always forget the applied ethics stuff every year after I teach it. This is like working it out on the spot. It's just, can you take the principles and apply them to the areas? So let's do it with telling lies. Utilitarianism, same story again. If it's going to maximize utility, yeah, tell a lie. Unless you're a rule utilitarian who has a rule telling you not to tell lies, and you're a strong rule utilitarian that will never break that. But yeah, for the other kinds, there might be acts that lead to maximizing pleasure through lying, and it might be your preference and the preference of many other people to lie. Say there's like, a mistake that a group is culpable for, and it's better, everyone decides that society is going to be better off if it's just covered up, and everyone who's culpable covers it up is happier as a result, or has the preference, sorry, to cover it up. Then you've got a utilitarian argument for lying. Kant, though, famously, no, do not lie. But then if you had a question on this, you need to show, well, why not? Well, why walk it through the categorical imperative? I'm almost sure I've used this in my example for the categorical imperative in this very video or a related video if you're just watching an applied ethics video by itself. Because it's not logically possible to live in a world where everyone lies. The whole notion of truth breaks down. It's not coherent in Kant's mind. Therefore, you have a perfect duty not to lie. It also violates the second and third formulations of the categorical imperative, because you're treating people as ends. You're trying to get something out of them. If you're lying to them, you're not treating them as valuable, rational beings. You're worthy and deserving of knowing the truth and making up their own minds and decisions about the truth. So do not lie for Kant. I glossed that very quickly, but there's plenty in there to expand and develop in more detail for 12 marks. And finally, virtue ethics, same old story. So there may be situations in which it's going to develop your virtues to lie. I don't think it is on his blacklist, lying, Aristotle. Yeah, if that's wrong, I'll come back and correct this video later and have to delete a load of this recording, but never mind. Yeah, if there might be situations, even that, hang on, no, truthfulness is a virtue for Aristotle, so it's going to be hard to cultivate that through lying. So most of the time it's not going to be an ethical action to lie, because it's not going to develop you in a virtuous way and progress you towards eudaimonia. However, there might be some situations and some circumstances where lying might be permissible, and suddenly a modern virtue ethicist who isn't tied to Aristotle's particular values and list of virtues which he believed were objective and rationally perceivable is going to be even more open to the possibility of lying in certain circumstances where it's going to develop you in a virtuous way. And you could expand on that by coming up with and explaining examples that would illustrate that. So there you go. A whistle stop, well, not really whistle stop at all. That was 23 minutes on applied ethics, but hopefully that's jogged your memory and helped you with applied ethics. Let's just talk though about the applied ethics essay, the imaginary possible applied ethics essay, which, to be a broken record, could in theory come up. It's possible that AQA A-level philosophy examination students could be asked an applied ethics essay, but it's never come up yet in 9 years. So this is really kind of like a perfectionist sort of just in case, cover all the bases. How would you do it if you got one, or if your teacher sets you one? Well, you can take it in any direction you want, because you can actually go normative on it, or you can go meta-ethical on it. I suggest, though, the most straightforward, easy way is that I think it's actually quite an easy essay if they give you an applied ethics essay. By the way, what would it be? It would be something like, is it wrong to steal? Or is it right to lie? Or is it morally okay, permissible, to simulate killing? Or whatever the last one is. Is it acceptable to eat animals? Can we morally accept eating animals? So that's actually quite easy, I think, because all you would need, one way of doing it that's quite straightforward, I think, is to just say what all the different theories say about it, and then evaluate the theories to say who you agree with most and what you would do and why. And if you're stumped for how to do that, you can just use the uppermost criticisms of the theories in your mind. It probably means you have to pick at least one to side with, unless you've got some really controversial take and you want to disagree with all of them. But yeah, let me go on to the next slide to explain this. Oh yeah, and by the way, if all the theories agree, which they don't really, but if they broadly agree, or you can make them agree, you've got consensus, and you can say, well, this is clearly the right thing to do because all the ethical theories say this. If they disagree, though, then you pick one in your analysis. But probably easier to show you this rather than just talk about it. So look, say you got is simulated killing wrong. Then you go intro, you can say, I think yes or no, and then say, probably useful to pin your colours to the mast and tie that opinion to a particular normative theory. So yes or no, because I agree with the utilitarian and or Kantian and or virtue ethical, or Aristotelian view, or maybe some combination, and maybe a little summary of why at the start, although that might be too difficult. It might be easier to put that into conclusion. And then you go, here's what utilitarians would say about simulated killing, which I've done for you earlier in the video. I like this or I don't like this. So I think this is helpful or unhelpful because, and you can use one of the criticisms that you know of utilitarianism or more to do that analysis. So e.g. you might think the utilitarian take on simulated killing is not helpful because of the problems with calculating pleasure inherent in utilitarianism. So that would be a way to do it. Then you're on to Kant. Here's what Kant would say about simulated killing. And then I agree with this opinion, this view of Kant, or I disagree, and here's why. Use what you know about Kant and criticisms of Kant to do that, either way, whichever way you're arguing. Because I suppose if you're siding with any of these, then you're defending it against possible criticism. So you'd say, I like this, I can imagine someone would not like it for this reason, but here's what I would say back. And then virtue ethics, same thing. Here's what virtue ethics would say about simulated killing, and here's my view on that. Here's my analysis and evaluation of that, and here's what I would say back to someone who disagreed with me on this issue. And then you've argued the case for a particular view on the issue and whether it's right or wrong. Probably in all likelihood, I imagine you're not going to be saying it's wrong if you're living in the 21st century. But who knows, you might have problems with it. But you sum that up in your conclusion. And then maybe you can say a bit more than you did at the start if you struggled to summarize early on, because you've had the chance to think it through in writing. Then now you've got the because. This is the view I agree with because here's my main reason summarized, and then Bob's your uncle, go home. Well done. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful to you as usual. Any comments or questions or what have you, anything you want to ask about further, just drop me a comment. And if this has been helpful to you, please like and subscribe and go and watch more exclusive videos on my Patreon. Cheers. Okie dokie, so this brings us to the wonderful world of meta-ethics, my favourite. I have actually recorded a whole separate video on meta-ethics, but I've lost the recording. So this is another take of my meta-ethics revision so that I can get it into this video, because for complex reasons, I can't cut it into this video without doing it again. But just so you know, there's all sorts on meta-ethics out there on YouTube, but if you want myself on meta-ethics, I do have a separate meta-ethics video. So if you like, I might be quicker or longer there. Go and look up meta-ethics on RPE with Dr. T's YouTube channel. But let's just do it quickly again now for completionism's sake. In meta-ethics, you need to know about the origin of moral principles, or the theories about the origins of moral principles. Do they come from reason, like the philosophers, most of the philosophers you've studied, the philosophers who came up with the normative ethical theories, that is, think? Do they simply come from our emotions or attitudes about the world, or are they societally constructed, or maybe some combination of all of those? This is kind of a heading at the start of meta-ethics. They've never yet asked a question specifically about this line of the bullet of the specification. However, it's sort of relevant to all of the meta-ethics stuff. So yeah, hopefully those are fairly self-explanatory. They'll come up in each of the meta-ethical theories that we look at shortly. But just be aware, you need to know about that. And yeah, this is the biggie. And it will come up again on the next slide too, the distinction between cognitivism and non-cognitivism about ethical language. You should already know it with regards to, no, sorry, you don't, if you're in year 12, lower 6th, AS or whatever, you don't know it yet. This will also be relevant. This is doubly useful for metaphysics of God, because you later need to know about this with regards to God. But here, with regards to ethical language, what does it mean? Well, cognitivism, from Latin cognosco, to know, I know, the idea that there is something to know when you use ethical language. You are talking about something which is a fact, which can be right or wrong and can be known in a meaningful way. And the most important part of that is you're expressing a fact which could be right or wrong. The ethical language is meaningful. That's what cognitivism holds. There is something to know there, to be right or wrong about, something to know correctly or incorrectly, so that the language is meaningful in a cognitive way. It's talking about facts which can be known. So this is weird, I know, it's very, very philosophical, but some philosophers think that when you use ethical language, it's actually non-cognitive. So these are non-cognitivists about ethical language. The alternative view would be that when you use ethical language, you are not actually saying something which can be right or wrong. It's not giving you a fact claim, a propositional statement about the world, which has any meaning in the sense that it could be right or wrong. It's just like an exclamation of an emotion or an attitude. You can maybe translate it into other propositions, which could be true or false, e.g., I feel bad about murder. That could be true or false, but just to say murder is wrong, according to a non-cognitivist, isn't actually telling you something that is possibly true or false. In propositional terms, in factual terms, it's actually meaningless. It expresses another kind of meaning, not a factual propositional one. So that's the biggest distinction in metaethics. Another one that's going to be very useful to you is, to remind you, moral realism compared with moral anti-realism. And this is subtly but importantly different. So moral realism and the first set of metaethical theories you need to know about are all morally realist, is the view that there are real, the clue's in the name, true moral facts that are part of the world or reality in some way. So there are true moral principles which are factually true, like murder is wrong. Well, that's just a statement, but a moral realist would typically believe, because it's fairly non-controversial, that to say murder is wrong is to express a true fact about the world. It's telling you something real about how the world is. You're getting a statement about reality that is true and gives you a true fact. And then moral anti-realism, which will be on the next slide, of course, is the view that there are no moral facts. There are not true moral facts because there is no objective morality out there. There's no binding, independent of us, moral truth for us to follow. It's just something else. It's opinions or prescriptions and what have you. And you'd expect that moral realism is going to go with cognitivism most of the time, because in order for there to be morally true facts, it must be possible that ethical language can be true or false. So yes, moral realism is always going to be cognitivist. However, cognitivism is not always going to go with realism, because you could be cognitivist about ethical language and think it gives you true / false, or sorry, excuse me, possibly true or false fact claims. Yeah, the language is expressing something which is factually meaningful, propositionally meaningful, but it never is true. So even though the language makes sense, it just happens that there are no moral facts out there. That would be cognitivist anti-realism, which is what Mackey, J.L. Mackey believes in. It's called error theory. We'll get there. I'm jumping the gun, but it's useful to have these distinctions set up at the start, because then, of course, non-cognitivism is typically going to go with anti-realism. We've just seen that anti-realism won't always go with non-cognitivism, but if you think that moral statements can't always be true or false, then it's going to be quite straightforward to see that there are no true moral statements, because there can't be. You've fallen at the first hurdle in that case. So cognitivism and realism often go together, but not always. And then non-cognitivism and anti-realism are always going to go together. But let's get into some more of the moral realist theories, revise these in a bit more depth. Gosh, this is becoming a huge video, but hopefully you can jump around within it to focus on what you especially want to revise. Or maybe you're just doing an enormous blitz and doing all of this at once, in which case, fair play to you. I hope you've got lots of coffee. So moral realism, here it is again, it's stated another way. The view that there are mind-independent moral properties or facts, that's yet another way of saying it, properties of the world. And two main moral realist and also cognitivist theories you need to know about, moral naturalism and non-naturalism. This just has to do with, in a sense, where do the moral properties reside? Where are these moral facts? And if a philosopher believes that they are a part of the world, part of nature, as it were, don't get confused and think that you can go out and find them with like a magnifying glass looking around in a field like a biologist or something. It's not that. It's just that they're built into the natural world. They're not on a different metaphysical level, as it were. So you can discover them by observing the natural world. So in that sense, you can use the magnifying glass is a metaphor. Okay, you can link them to other natural properties is the best way of saying it. This is moral naturalism. It might help to have an example. So for example, utilitarianism is morally naturalist because it says that goodness, moral goodness, is connected with happiness / pleasure. So if you want to find where moral goodness is, just go and find some happiness or pleasure. That is something that is self-evidently good that we should be maximizing. So utilitarianism in its original form is therefore a naturalist theory. You can also do virtue ethics versions of it, because what is good for virtue ethicists? Well, it's eudaimonia, which is something we can observe. We can go and find someone flourishing, and then we have found something that is good, a person who is flourishing. So again, what goodness is connected to features of the natural world which we can observe directly with our senses. So that's moral naturalism. There are true moral facts, and we can discover them through observation of the natural world, hence moral naturalism. Then non-naturalism is very similar. It's still cognitivist, it's still realist. Ethical statements can be true or false. There are true moral facts out there to discover. The difference is they're not built into the natural world, they're non-natural. In a sense, supernatural. Often non-naturalists will be supernaturalists, but maybe that's an unhelpful extra bit of detail. Yeah, lots of students really get hung up with moral non-naturalism. Don't. It's much easier than you think. It's simply the idea that there are true moral facts, but rather than observing the world to discover them, we perceive them with our minds, with a special faculty of our minds. We intuit them in Moore's language. So it's also known as intuitionism in its most common form. It just means we have a special ability of the mind. Of course, this is very easy to argue back with and criticize, but this is the idea. Our minds have a special ability. Part of our rational faculties is that we can perceive what moral truth is. And we need to do that because it's not built into the natural world. Moral truths exist on a separate order, or in a separate order, or almost on a separate plane, plane, as it were, of existence. They have a special metaphysical status. And Moore, G.E. Moore, who's most famously associated with non-naturalism, you'll remember his open question argument for this is that if a naturalist is saying the good is X, whatever it is, so for a utilitarian, the good is happiness, or a virtue ethicist, the good is eudaimonia, or a human, or something fulfilling its function, saying it a different way, you can always say back to them, but is it really? And Moore's argument is that that is actually a legitimate question, because the naturalist cannot definitively prove that they have answered that question. It's still open to rational discussion. It remains an open question whether the good is that property. Therefore, Moore argues, to associate the good fundamentally with that property is a mistake. It's a category error. You've mixed up goodness, which actually resides in a category of its own, in a non-natural level of existence, with non-natural metaphysical status. So what you're doing is you're mistakenly reducing, so this is a criticism of, he calls naturalism reductive, reducing goodness to something that it often, maybe even always, but at least often turns up with in the natural world. So yeah, fair enough. Often goodness and pleasure will be found in the same place, but to mistake pleasure for goodness is a fundamental error, says Moore, because if you ask the question, is goodness really pleasure? Is the good pleasure? You can still say, well, maybe it isn't. It's still a legitimate open question that the naturalist can't solve and answer. Hence, goodness must be something irreducible. That means something in a category of its own that cannot be explained in terms of something else, cannot be reduced down into the terms of something else. Another way of saying this is that Moore thinks that naturalism or naturalist metaethical theories commit the naturalistic fallacy. That is, once again, they confuse something that is associated with a thing with the thing itself. Best example is Moore's own one, light, or in fact yellow. He uses yellow, doesn't he? What is yellow? Well, to know what yellow is, you have to just experience yellow. You have to see yellow for yourself to know what yellow is. Yellow is not just a certain wavelength of light that you could analyze in a physics lab. Yes, wherever you find yellow, you'll also be able to find that wavelength, but to say that yellow is the wavelength is a category mistake. You've committed a fallacy, a logical error of mixing up something that occurs in the natural world wherever the other thing is present with that thing itself. Same is happening for the naturalists, Moore argues, with goodness. So in the analogy, goodness stands in for yellow, and whatever the naturalist is saying goodness is stands in for the wavelength of light. So just as it would be a mistake to say that the wavelength is yellow, it's a mistake to say that pleasure is goodness. To know what goodness is, just like with yellow, you have to see it for yourself. You have to intuit it for yourself with your mind. Hence, there are true moral facts out there. We must perceive them, we must intuit them with the powers of our mind. There you go, there's non-naturalism. I may have done it better in the other video, and to be honest, there's tons of metaethics stuff out there, so you might be skipping this, but that's my best effort today. Lots of issues with all these theories. Good old Hume's fork, which blends into AJA's verification principle, essentially the same thing, can be brought to bear on both of these, because is it really logically the case that you can show that the goodness is out there and that it's either a natural property or a non-natural property? Well, I mean, even Moore is saying that the naturalists can't do that logically. But you could very well argue back with Moore, hang on, you haven't shown anything deductively here. You haven't logically shown that these certain statements are factually true, like murder is wrong. You haven't proved anything. You've just asserted some things and said that you have this special power of your mind to perceive things. But that's an open question. You could say back to Moore whether you've got it right, whether murder is actually wrong in any objective sense. So it's not logically demonstrable, but equally well, it's not empirically verifiable either, if we're going to go to the other prong of the fork. Once again, Moore's already said that about naturalism. There's no way of checking that happiness must be pursued in some objective sense, in a must way. And equally well, we can't check that what Moore believes are non-naturally true properties of the world about ethics are true or not. There's no way of verifying or checking this. So therefore, Hume and Ayer would say these statements are factually meaningless about ethics and morality. Similar lines, Hume also has an argument. Now, this is a subtle and tricky one, but if you think it through, it's not too hard. Hume also has an argument that moral judgments can't be beliefs. So this is because we're all in the world of philosophy of language here. This is a criticism against cognitivism, against the cognitivist aspect of these morally realist theories, because if they're not beliefs, then they can't have truth or falsity. They don't have true/false. They don't pertain in that way. So how does he know they're not beliefs? Well, Hume argues that beliefs can never motivate us to do anything. Now, I think you can criticize this as well, and this I would argue back with Hume about this, but just to understand the specification point, let's take an example. Let's take a belief. Paris is the capital of France. Yeah? Well, great. Fantastic. Whoop-de-doo. You know that Paris is the capital of France, but what does that motivate you to do? Absolutely nothing. This is an example to illustrate that for Hume, just knowing information about the world, which is what beliefs are about, for Hume, cannot compel you or give you a reason to do anything. It just tells you stuff that's out there. But the reason you do things for Hume is because of your passions, because of your feelings. Those are the things that motivate you. But those aren't beliefs. They're just emotional experiences that you're having in your being as part of the bundled reality of your existence. All right. So Hume argues that because moral judgments, because moral judgments are not beliefs, because they don't motivate us. I'm tying myself in knots here. They cannot be beliefs, and therefore moral realism fails, cognitivism fails. Yeah, that one was a bit wonky today as well, but I did my best. Maybe look at the other video. The is-ought gap is perhaps a bit easier to get your head around. All of these points are related, of course, because they're coming from Hume and Ayer's thought world. But the is-ought gap, remember, is the idea that you can never legitimately infer an ought or a should in more modern language. The is-should gap might be easier for you to understand it from an is. In other words, it is illogical, invalid, illegitimate to move from a description about how the world is, you see how this related to the previous point, to a prescription about how it should be. If we look around and see that, oh, these people are happy, this action makes me happy, well, fine, you've described the world, but there's no reason, strictly speaking, logically, why it ought to be the case that such actions that produce happiness should be pursued. There's no reason why we should pursue happiness just because it is the case that people like being happy. If you're being strictly logical, Hume points out, and I think this is successful in this case, then this, despite what I said about the previous point, because there's some distinctions to be made, then yeah, it's fallacious, it's illogical to make this jump. Therefore, any kind of claim that there is an objective morality, any kind of appeal to something about how the world is compelling us to make it be a certain way or behave in a certain way is faulty for Hume. You can't move from an is to an ought or an is to a should if you're being reasonable or a good philosopher. And then lastly on this slide, one more slide to go after this, we've got J.L. Mackie's argument from relativity and his arguments from queerness. So these are arguments not against cognitivism, but against the realist aspects of these theories. First of all, from relativity, this is one of the most famous statements in the literature of the argument that will be familiar to many, that if there are objective moral truths, why do so many people disagree with them? Why is it that in one country, in one nation, certain norms hold and people say you should do this, you shouldn't do that, but in another country, another nation, or maybe another time, another epoch, another period of history, these things should be done and these things should not be done? Why do people disagree? This seems to suggest, Mackie argues, that these truths, so-called truths, are actually relative. There are no absolutes in the world of morality. Even though the language makes sense, as we'll see on the next slide, it's always false because there are no objective moral principles. Because if there were, people would agree with them. Mackie says it's the most sensible inference to make, or induction to make, that actually there are no objective moral truths, rather than saying that just some people are wrong about them and some people are right. It's much more sensible to conclude that there just aren't any real moral facts. And then he goes on to argue, this is in Ethics Inventing Right and Wrong, by the way, which is a very good, useful book for ethics, highly recommend it, that even if there were such moral truths, they would be very strange things. Similarly to Hume, perhaps, how could there be these properties of the world that could motivate us or compel us to do certain things? Mackie argues we never encounter any other such properties. Nothing else in our language operates in this way. So queerness, remember, is an old-fashioned word for strangeness. This is almost a reductio ad absurdum kind of argument, because he's saying that this idea of real, factually pertaining moral properties that we can express in moral language is so queer or strange as to be ridiculous. How could there be properties of the world which mean that we should behave in certain ways? How could certain truths of reality make us or compel us to act in a certain way? This is strange. This is queer. This cannot be. There you go. That's the plotted summary of this. One more slide. So here it is, moral anti-realism. I'll try and speed up a bit because I'm aware that I'm wittering on quite a lot as usual. Moral anti-realism. So simply the view that there are no mind-independent moral properties or facts. There are no true objective moral statements. And like we've said before, you can do this in a cognitive way or a non-cognitivist way. By the way, there are loads of other meta-ethical theories as well. These, of course, are just the ones on the AQA philosophy syllabus. So you should stick to these for your A-level philosophy exam. But just be aware there are other categories in meta-ethics to use, and this is just a selection. But anyway, cognitivist style anti-realism is associated here with Mackey. So this would be the view that, remember, the language could be true or false in the sense it is meaningful, but it just so happens that because there are no mind-independent moral objective facts, it's always false. So it's trying to give, the moral language is trying to give true statements in an actually meaningful way. This language makes sense. Yeah, it's not saying something which is not propositionally relevant. It's just because there are no moral facts, even though it's attempting to do that, it always fails. So it makes an error. It's like saying something with correct grammar, but that just is wrong about the world. Like, outside my window right now, there is an enormous pink blob monster floating around. Yeah, the grammar was correct there, but it's wrong. There isn't, thankfully. I would need to go to the doctor if there was. So that's cognitivist anti-realism. Non-cognitivist anti-realism is that the language doesn't even make sense. It can't be right or wrong. So of course there are no true moral facts, because it would need to be able to make sense in order for there to be true moral facts. So what is moral language doing? That's the distinction between emotivism and prescriptivism. For Ayer and Hume, this goes back to Hume as well, it's just expressing an emotion. It's giving you an emotional, it's telling you something about the emotions of the speaker. So if someone says murder is wrong, it just means I feel badly about murder, or murder bad, or boo murder, me no like murder. For a prescriptivist, it's telling you a command. So it's telling you an attitude, it's expressing an attitude or something that the speaker wants to prescribe about the world. So if you say murder is wrong, for Richard Hare, here he is down here, it means, all that means is do not murder, or I don't want you to murder. And note, there's no appeal to kind of any higher objective truth there. It's not an objective fact that murder is wrong and murder should not be done. It's just that the speaker saying murder is wrong doesn't want people to murder, and so is prescribing, hence prescriptivism, commanding do not murder, telling other people not to murder. That was a bit quicker, wasn't it? I'm speeding up towards the end, which is probably good. I should stop self-narrating my own video. Issues that arise for the theories above. Well, what are the key criticisms of these ideas on the specification? Can anti-realism account for how we use moral language and how we morally reason and persuade and disagree? So this is the point, that if this language doesn't refer to any kind of objective facts out there that are true, then why is it that we use it so much? There is so much moral debate with your friends, with people you feel have done you wrong, with your family members, in Parliament, in lawmaking, on the news. Why is all this argument about what is right or wrong if the language doesn't actually mean anything in a factual sense? And of course, the anti-realists are perfectly able to argue that just because the language is used a lot, that doesn't mean that it's factually relevant and gives you factual propositions. There's some more subtle stuff to get into here, which I won't take time to go into, about precisely how the language works. But that's going to be the basic disagreement, is that the realists will say, well, how could we persuade people? How could we reason with others and disagree and so on if this language doesn't refer to anything out there? And the anti-realists just come back and use their own theories to explain. So for an emotivist, if you're arguing with someone, if you're apparently reasoning with someone about a moral issue, you're just clarifying different emotions about it and making different emotional appeals to different emotions in the speaker. And you might be able to bring out, in the speakers, sorry, you might be able to bring out some deeper emotions or some more emotions about an issue to change someone's mind. Or you might be able to turn their attention to other phenomena which will provoke different emotions and so on. Or you've just got different emotions about an action and that's why you disagree. So there are ways of arguing back on this point, of course, as with any philosophical point, except really, really bad ones, I suppose. And next up, the problem of accounting for moral progress. So the realist will say, if there are no objective moral truths out there, how is it that we can make moral progress and society can get better, can move towards, a better, a more good, that's what better means, way of doing things. And this can be quite a tricky one for a contemporary anti-realist to deal with, especially one living in the 21st century. If you think it's good that society is more tolerant of, say, LGBT people or neurodiverse people or whatever it might be, certain different races, it's less sexist and so on. For an anti-realist, it's not actually objectively better, these things. It's just that we prefer it for some reason, or at this particular moment in time, we like it / want to command it. Again, the anti-realist can just argue back and say, yeah, you may not like this, but technically there is no such thing as moral progress. That might be too hard to square for some people, though. So that's what that issue is about. And the criticism, lastly, of anti-realism, that it becomes moral nihilism. Nihilism, from Latin nihil, literally nothingism. So moral nihilism, there are different forms of it, which the textbooks will tell you about, but basically, in essence, the view that, well, stemming from there being no objective moral facts, anti-realism, therefore nothing matters. Nothing is of value in any higher objective sense. So in a sense, life itself is meaningless. That's the sort of the conclusion of extreme nihilism. Isn't that bleak? Isn't that miserable? Isn't that no way to live your life? Can that really be true? That's the criticism. And the anti-realist might come back to that and say, depending on how you're understanding nihilism, no, this isn't nihilist. It doesn't mean that the language isn't useful or helpful in some sense. It's just not objective. It's not factually referential. Or they might say, bite the bullet and say, yeah, it is nihilist, but I'm afraid the world's like that, unfortunately. If depending on how you're using the sense of nihilism, maybe there is no meaning to life and nothing is really good or bad in any kind of fundamental sense. But that might actually be quite liberating, because then just live your life how you want to. Think of Nietzsche and his book Beyond Good and Evil. If you do away with good and evil, you've got nothing left. Yeah, fine, but you can build on that nothing, so to speak, and just do what you want. You could say it gives a platform for existentialism and not just nihilism. But there you go, there's that one. Oh yeah, and of course I've just remembered, sorry, this isn't the last slide, but you want one more, you do want one more slide, don't you? Because what happens if you get an essay question on metaethics? Well, let me tell you. Let me tell you my opinion anyway. So if they ask it, it's going to be something like, are there objective moral facts? Or is realism true, or is anti-realism true? Something like that. It's the fundamental meta-ethical question, isn't it? Based on everything we've just been saying. Are there objective moral properties or not? Which is correct? Anti-realism or realism? They might ask it in terms of cognitivism, but you'd be able to do that too. What are we going to do about this? Think and decide your own opinion and argue for that as ever. Of course, that would be the best course of action. But if you want to be cynical, if you want to play the game, according to surveys, field papers, blah, 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 most philosophers are moral realists. Now, I find this astonishing because the majority of philosophers don't believe in God. And personally, I don't think that there can be objective moral facts if there's no moral lawgiver to guarantee them. So I'm so astonished that 60% roughly of contemporary philosophers want to hold on to objective moral facts. Fair enough, some of those will be theists, but I'm not sure how they pull this off. That's just my view, though, because actually, if you're being cynical, sensibly, because that is the majority view, if you're being really cynical, then you therefore want to argue in favor of moral realism. Though that's actually harder. Let me give you some suggestions about how you do this and actually argue the other way, depending on what you want to do. In my view, basically, if you're going to argue for moral realism, the biggest issue you have to deal with is that argument from relativity. Well, why doesn't everyone agree on them? So there, in this case, in your essay, in your analysis, you need to give an account, an explanation for why, in your view, they're not agreed on. Maybe it's because some people are stupid. That's a typical thing that philosophers say. So, for example, in some forms of intuitionism, Moore says something like this. And Pritchard, who we didn't mention, but you could look into as well, argues that, yeah, some people don't intuit the moral facts correctly because they are uneducated or they're not fully mature and developed in their powers of reason and rational intuition of these moral facts. So you could say that some people don't get them. You could also try and argue that, yes, there is relativity around the edges, the tricky cases, but actually when it comes to the basics, most humans are going to agree from culture to culture. You could try and use some anthropological research here, do some extra research, look into this question, see what Google or ChatGPT tells you about common moral principles. But you could, well, try and argue that, say, something like good old do not murder is actually going to be fairly universal around human history and around different human cultures. So perhaps there is a core that people are able to agree on, which suggests that maybe that is objectively true in arguing back to the argument from relativity. And it's only fringe groups or fringe people like psychopaths. Yeah, you can use good old idiots and children and psychopaths, lump those all together into the same boat as examples of people who aren't sensible, rational thinking beings. I'm being slightly facetious here, but you get the point. Those are the sorts of arguments you could make if you were to write about this. If you want to go the other way, though, and say that there are no moral facts, then I think the biggest issue you have to deal with is kind of the emotive force that's going to hit you back if you say that, okay, so actually, for example, think of the worst things you can think of. Let's, the Holocaust or rape or child abuse and other absolutely horrific things. So, I'm thinking of the absolutely worst things I can think of in human action. If you're an anti-realist, these things aren't actually objectively wrong in any higher, elevated, binding sense. Is just that we don't like them or we don't want them to be done and we command that they not be done. Can you really face up to that as an anti-realist? Well, I think if there isn't a God, you have to say yes, because because of the is-ought problem. There is no objective reason why those things must not be done. It's just that we don't like them, or maybe we've evolved not to like them. And the anti-realist is, if you're arguing that way, you've got to deal with this, and you might just have to say, yeah, you might not like this conclusion, but philosophy shouldn't be telling you, or doesn't tell you what you would like to know. It tells you what is the case if it's being done well on most views of philosophy. So just because a conclusion is unappealing or unattractive or even counterintuitive doesn't mean that it's incorrect. And because there's no logical way of showing that these so-called moral facts are out there and have any objective truth, it simply must be accepted. That's the sort of discussion that I would get into if I was going to argue that way in an essay. But yeah, for more help on essays, I refer you to my how to do a 25-mark essay video. This video has gone on for far too long, but I hope it's been useful to you. Let me know if it is. Let me know anything else you would like me to do videos on. And good luck in the no doubt impending exam. Take care out there. All the best. Happy birthday, and you're welcome.